Howdy everyone, my name is Moonman, and today we're going to be discussing raids and ashes of creation. We're going to go through raid design, design philosophy, raid sizes and compositions, location, adaptive raid difficulty, and finally covering the looting system that will apply in raids, including the loot tagging system. Some of this information is similar to dungeons, and I just did a video on that last week, so if you're interested, definitely give that a watch. I really just started this channel a couple weeks ago, and we'll be releasing a video on naval content next week. If you enjoy the content, smash that like button and subscribe. It really helps me out, and I appreciate all of you that have subscribed thus far. Let's begin with raid design and design philosophy. Similar to dungeons, most raids will be open world, and the minority of raids will be instanced. Unlike dungeons, we don't have an exact percentage split as far as how many open world raids versus instance raids. So that might be an 80-20 split, similar to dungeons, or potentially even a 90-10 split. That said, some raid boss rooms will be instanced, but it sounds like this will be limited to large encounters for the most part. There are both raid bosses and world bosses, and I see a raid boss as something your raid has to clear trash to get to. There are likely multiple raid bosses within the raid, whereas a world boss is a singular boss, maybe has some trash, but is potentially more accessible. With so many raids being open world, it begs the question as to how lockouts will work, and if we'll be able to repeatedly do raids and effectively farm the same raid over and over. Luckily, we have a little bit of information around this, but not quite the full picture. Raids will trigger either off of events happening in the world or using traditional systems. The team has not yet made a final decision on this. That means a raid could spawn when a story arc reaches a certain point in the story, or a node reaches a certain level of influence. For anyone that doesn't understand story arcs or node influence, the quick overview is that story arcs are effectively longer quest lines that open up as a result of player activity. That could mean players finishing out various quests, or maybe even over farming an area, or even a story arc specific to your personal or class-based activity. Story arcs are influenced by world activity and can drive changes to the world. And one of those changes could be spawning raid content. Node influence and node progression are also driven by player activity, where players can progress a node and effectively level up a node to create a larger city or town. Nodes can progress to the point of being a large metropolis. In other words, nodes or town areas can be leveled up and progressed through player action. That could be dedicating resources to the node or completing a multitude of quests for the node through the bulletin board system and so on. An important aspect is how story arcs and node progression are combined, because certain story arcs can't open up until a node progresses to a certain point. Now that that is out of the way, let's get into the really interesting things about raids. Oh, and I forgot just one thing, just a quick word from our sponsor for today. Go ahead and cue that clip.
Are you waiting for a game that may seemingly never come out? Is the copium so strong that you occasionally lose consciousness? Don't you worry. Moonman's Moon Pills are here to save you. These uniquely designed pills will put you into a slumber and wake you up the moment Ashes of Creation is released. Skip the wait and order your Moon Pills today.
Disclaimer: this is just a joke. Don't take sketchy pills from strangers.
There will be about 12 to 15 raid bosses in the world initially. Legendary equipment will drop, but only from legendary world bosses. This might be a mistake on the wiki, because I have to imagine there are legendary raid bosses as well, but who knows. All I care is that we can get those sweet Garfields and Kennys. Oranges, guys. If those references weren't obvious, you might be in the wrong place. No more Professor Plums for these gamers, though legendaries are going to be extremely rare, it seems like. I mean, the team plans on only a single-digit percentage of the population being able to complete certain portions of the content. And considering that legendary is probably the highest tier of difficulty, if you see someone running around with a legendary item, they are the sweatiest of sweat lords. And you probably shouldn't envy them, because they have no life. Of course, I plan on getting a legendary if that tells you anything about me. Anywho, raids are going to have a ton of mechanics, and because PvP could be prevalent during various raid bosses, you can coordinate your group to utilize boss mechanics against other groups. That's right, you won't always be in a 40 vs 1 fight against a raid boss. There could be another raid group there, and you could need to strategize to wipe that raid group and eliminate the competition. In terms of raid mechanics, there will be multiple phase fights, adds, additional monsters that join the fight during a phase or periodically, random skill usage, whether that's breathing fire, shooting random projectiles, and so on, and as a result, your raid will need to strategize around your location and mobility. Something that is really cool about raid bosses is that their mechanics may be affected by changes in climate or even time of day. So if it's the middle of winter, the boss may have different mechanics than if it was in the spring, or if it's the middle of the day versus the middle of night. Lastly, raid bosses will have telegraphed animations. What that means is that the boss will do some sort of animation to indicate that they are about to use an ability. Even though the boss will telegraph that they are going to use an ability, there will be no indicator showing where the ability is going to hit necessarily. In other words, there won't be any templates on the ground showing what's about to happen. I personally love this, and it takes me back to how raids should be. You have to do the boss enough times to know what animations are indicating which ability, and then position yourself accordingly or utilize abilities accordingly. That said, the team has said that there will be variables that change elements of the raid, such as types and number of bosses, their skills, and so on. Raids and Ashes of Creation are meant to be 40-person raids and will have various elements that can be pre-planned, but not everything can be pre-planned. Meaning you can plan out your raid composition and raid positioning, but as I just mentioned, there will be variables that causes changes to the types of bosses and their skills. So just because you did the same boss weeks ago, it may be an entirely different encounter when you come back. As far as raid composition, obviously we won't be able to give too many details here because A, we don't have enough information, and B, like with any raid, your composition will change depending on the raid needs and requirements. Let's start with what we do know though. There will only be one tank class and healer class. Though all other classes can off-tank or off-heal if they choose the proper subclass, the only real tank class is the class archetype literally labeled tank. I'm sure they'll come up with another name because tank is, well, not quite fantasy enough for me. The only real healing class will be the cleric. For other classes to be able to off-tank or off-heal, they will need to pick up tank or cleric as their secondary archetype, and that will enable them to tank or heal more effectively. I'm a little bit iffy on their decision to only have one true tank class and one true healing class. I get the feeling that it could create some stale gameplay loops and lack of decision making when it comes to raid composition, because you may need to stack your raid with a ton of clerics or always bring multiple quote tank archetypes. That said, maybe through immense amount of variability in abilities, secondary archetypes, and so on, I'll be wrong, and all the dynamics in the class systems will even this out. Obviously, we won't really know until we start playing, and as I talk through that, I'm thinking that the team will ensure that off-tanks and off-healers will bring enough power to the equation to drive lots of variability in raid composition. Typical 40-man raid comps are as such. Usually you'll have 12 to 14 melee DPS, 12 to 14 range DPS, 2 tanks, and 10 to 12 healers. For easier content, you can stack more DPS than healers, and for certain encounters you might run more healers, but 2 tanks is typically what you can expect, though some encounters may require more. Since we haven't played an Ashes of Creation raid, we don't know exactly how raid comps will look. Maybe we can get away with 5 to 6 healers and heavily stacked DPS, or maybe we'll need 10 to 15 healers, I don't know. My best guess is that the team aims to create a balanced raid experience largely based on the expected makeup of classes. Since only one class is considered a main healer and only one class is considered a main tank, it would make sense that the tank requirement would be low, but I wonder what the healing requirements will look like. It's quite possible that raids will require a large amount of off heals. I could see the raid composition looking more like this: 15 to 18 dedicated DPS, 10 to 15 DPS or off heals or off tanks, 2 main tanks, and 8 to 10 main healers. I feel like the team is going to aim to have off healing and off tanking be a big part of raid composition to A, incentivize classes using tank or cleric as their secondary archetype, and B, drive the need for a large range of secondary archetype benefits. Either way, my hope is that raid composition allows for a fair amount of flexibility and the need for many different archetypes and secondary archetypes. I'm not a fan of the WoW Classic model, where you could stack almost entirely warriors and you'd be the top parsing and quickest clearing raid. I like the idea of raids that have a need for almost every class in the game, and where every class can either perform on a similar level or specific classes fill specific niches in the scope of a raid environment. Anywho, moving on to raid locations, unfortunately we don't have much information on this specific to raids. If we use dungeons as a basis for expectations here, then that would mean that there would be a raid for each node in the world. I don't think it makes much sense that there would be 85 different raids in Ashes of Creation though, but it also wouldn't make sense to not have a raid for every node, because if there's not a raid for each node, it would mean that certain nodes that develop wouldn't play into any raid content necessarily. So we'd create the groundwork for players to ignore certain nodes and would put a higher value on other nodes. So for now, we don't really know how many raids there will be or how exactly raid locations will be chosen. I wonder if they might be placed between various nodes and multiple nodes feed into the raid in some way. We do know that initially there will be 12 to 15 raid bosses in the world, and that player activity and node development will likely influence the introduction of more raids. Long-winded way of saying we'll find out soon enough. We may not know raid locations or quantity, but we do know their difficulty will be adaptive. Unlike other adaptive systems that typically only look at the number of players, Ashes of Creation's adaptive difficulty is much more in-depth. The system will look at the number of players participating to adjust difficulty, but the more interesting piece of the system is that it will also look at performance of previous encounters. What this means is that you could enter the raid and easily defeat the first boss, but then the second boss will adapt and become harder because your performance was so great on the first boss. I think the core goal of this system is to ensure that no one engages in raid content without having a certain level of difficulty. Another important aspect of the adaptive difficulty is that when it is looking at the number of players in the encounter, the bosses will put more weight on casting AoE spells than if there were a smaller number of players. Even though raids are meant for 40 players, I wonder if this means that it could be advantageous to bring less than 40, or if this is specifically meant for when multiple raids are trying to engage the same boss. That would mean that multiple raids taking on the same boss could create conditions where every raid fails because the difficulty has increased so much, and the number of AoEs going out could be potentially unmanageable. I really like that these systems are in place and that the team is trying to ensure that all encounters feel fresh no matter what. You have adaptive scaling of content difficulty combined with potential changes to spells and the whole encounter depending on the season and time of day, and changes that may happen due to player activity through node development and story arcs. I feel like raids are going to be very interesting because there is so much that can change and adjust even on a boss you've fought previously. Because the majority of raids are open world, raid looting is a very important detail to understand. Not just passing out loot, but more importantly the way that loot tagging works. It seems likely that other raids would be present and that competition to get the tag or loot from a specific boss will be prevalent. As far as loot systems themselves, these should be familiar to any MMO gamer. There will be free-for-all, loot master, round robin, and need before greed. Free-for-all should be self-explanatory. Loot master is when an individual is in charge of choosing who receives an item. Round robin is when the loot goes to different members in a cycle, and need before greed is when you can choose to need or greed an item, and those that roll greed will only be able to roll if no one has needed on the item. So effectively you're only rolling against people that needed or only people that greeded, with need having a higher weight on the roll ultimately. The last looting system is still up for debate as to whether it will be implemented, but the team is investigating potentially introducing a GDKP system. In other words, a bidding system into the game. I'm personally against this just because I know it creates a large potential for players to engage in third-party transactions, and as a result, the one with the most real money is the one with the most in-game currency to effectively win all the loot. Again, this is still something that the team is thinking about implementing and is not 100% going to be in the game. For those that don't know, GDKP is basically a bidding system where you bid your in-game currency for items, and then at the end of the raid it is split amongst everyone that participated. Anywho, loot tagging is really the biggest concern here because of how much open world content there will be. In order to secure the loot tag, you can't just tag the boss or mob first. The system will be taking into account two things. One, if you get the tag first, and two, is dependent on dealing the most damage. If you get the first hit on the boss, you'll get an additional edge over opponents to get the loot tag. But if your opponents do significantly more damage, you likely will not get the loot. I have some concerns with the system because it could incentivize certain raid groups to bring an overwhelming amount of DPS to ensure they almost always get the loot tag, while letting competing raid groups handle dealing with the tanking of the boss. That said, you could argue that if a raid brings a non-balanced composition, they may have a hard time even staying alive long enough to get the tag on the boss. I don't really know until I try some raid bosses. On one hand, you could say this is a huge plus for creating innovative strategies to secure loot, and on the other, you could say this creates potential for effectively sidestepping content in a way. Let me know your guys' thoughts on this. I'm actually really curious how everyone feels about this loot tagging system and the potential consequences it could create. The last thing to touch on here is the loot tables. Oh yes, the one thing we care about when it comes to raids. What's in it for me? Money, gear, prestige, glory? That's what raiding's all about. Excuse me, I got a little carried away there. Back to it. Loot tables from world bosses or dungeon bosses has a small RNG chance of dropping gear, or in other words, completed items. There's a much higher chance that materials and unique recipes are dropped that can be used to craft items of equitable value. This is an important aspect here. Gear's only a small part of the drops from raids, and unique recipes for craftables and unique materials is the more likely reward. That means crafting is going to be a huge aspect of Ashes of Creation. Similar to how Thunder Fury was the most beastly weapon in vanilla WoW, I can see unique craftable items being some of the best gear in the game for Ashes. I personally like that a lot because it isn't just about completing the raid boss, it's also about working with your guild to then gather the materials to help each other acquire more gear outside of raiding. It's actually a pretty common thread through the whole game. Working with others is going to be a major aspect of the game, and I get the feeling that those with a tight-knit group will be the ones that succeed. Back to loot. Legendary equipment is only dropped by legendary world bosses. The stats on dropped items will vary based on the rarity of the item. There won't be specific loot drops for artisans, and loot tables are likely to not be affected by weather conditions. The last thing here is that drop changes will likely not be made public. The question in my mind is if loot tables will be made public. I personally hope not, and I also hope that the team finds a way to stop data miners from acquiring the information. I thoroughly enjoy MMOs being an experience of delving into the unknown. The less people that can theory craft and pre-plan routes for being, quote, meta, the better. I love discovering things about the game and finding new weird ways to play it. That's all I have for this video, and thanks so much for watching. Make sure to smash that like button and subscribe for more. I'm working on an Ashes of Creation naval content video next, and there is a ton to unpack with that, so I can't wait to dive in. I'll catch you all in the next one. Moonman out.